All right, so welcome to the Thousand Ant podcast, and I'm joined today by Tor and Bryan, who are from Sirenix, who are the makers of Odin. For the folks who are not familiar with Odin, give us a little overview.
All right, Odin. It's a plugin for the Unity that you can think of it kind of like a suite of productivity tools, specifically angled towards workflow improvement, editor customization, and extending the Unity editor in various ways, and also extending the kinds of data that you can work with in Unity, like extending the serialization is the technical term of Unity assets, basically, in ways that many developers really appreciate.
Awesome, yeah,
And
and for
yeah.
those who kind of have followed the channel, I definitely have used and recommended Odin in the past. I'm a happy Odin user. I've got it integrated in the Untitled Cute Space game that we're working on, and I've really enjoyed working with it. To the kind of, I know that there's a pretty rich set of functionality there. I have only just scratched the surface. Very simple feature that I'm constantly advocating for is the ability to quickly add a button to the inspector. This is like, from a productivity perspective, this is just one of my favorite, super simple, easy to use features. That's just like, you want to call a function from your code and you don't have any UI hooked up for it. You just add this little button attribute and bing, away it goes. It makes me super happy.
Yeah, and Odin is just a billion of those little things put together in this big framework that makes it easy for them to work together and add more of them.
Yeah, totally. No, that's awesome. So I think, to frame the conversation that we're going to have and provide some context, let's kind of go back to the beginning. So how did Odin come into existence, and how did you guys get started? How did you get started working together? Let's start from the beginning.
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, it started back when I was in college as a student. I was dissatisfied, shall we say, with my team members in some of the projects we were having. So I went around headhunting everybody and who I saw was making awesome stuff. And then we formed this sort of like team of friends who always would do the projects together and team up. Specifically, it was me and Bjarke, another of the co-founders of Odin, who's not here in this podcast. So we started working together a lot, and eventually we made our own company, and we were going to make games, was the idea at the time. We were actually making a game, and we were having now we're coming out of college, we're making a game, and we're having so much trouble with the editor. And we tried something called Vexa framework, and it was a huge pain. And we had to do so much editor customization that we started, and we had to do our own data serialization for, save file formats and stuff. And so we just started solving all of these problems that Odin is made to solve in these generic ways. The story is there's so many. It's interesting the things that end up happening, right? Because there's so many random little events that happen. Actually, we were applying for EU grant that was for funding for a different kind of project, procedural 3D generation tool that we were going to have to build Odin to do. So then we got the grant, the EU funding, and then we started building Odin so we could build this other tool. And then as we were building Odin, we were like, which wasn't Odin at the time, it was just the tooling we needed to do the other thing. We were like, hey, this is pretty great. We should just do this instead. And then we published Odin, and here we are, right? Then it slowly became a success. We originally started in a partnership with DevDog, which is where Bryan eventually came in. Yeah, which DevDog was our publisher for a while until they had to go separate ways, and Bryan came over here with us, and now we're working together on Odin, and things were great.
Awesome. Awesome. And just for kind of additional geographical context, where was this taking place? You mentioned the EU.
Oh, yeah, I was in Denmark. We're all Danish, which is where, Odin comes from, right? And my name is Thor, which is also Nordic mythology. And it just seemed like a nice, like a very good, short, strong name. And also, Odin is the god of knowledge. A big part of Odin Inspector is kind of related to that, actually, how it
Awesome.
works.
I love it. Actually, it's funny. I've been diving back into Norse mythology because I've been reading to my kids the Neil Gaiman's kind of adaptation or book of the Norse myths, which is amazing. And I recommend to anybody if they want a kind of an accessible entry point to Norse mythology. It's terrific.
I don't think I read that.
It's good. I mean, Neil Gaiman, who wrote the Sandman comics and a bunch of other great novels and all kinds of stuff.
I read Good Omens, which
Yeah,
was his collaboration with Terry Pratchett. Amazing, amazing book.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
loved it.
yeah. So he did a kind of, I don't know how faithful. I think it's relatively faithful retelling of a bunch of kind of, I mean, it's definitely faithful to the kind of, all the characters are the same, and I think the mythology, I don't know enough of it well enough to know if he's like playing tricks with it or being faithful, but it's very well written and entertaining. So yeah, I think that's a great kind of, you know, capsule origin story from Tor's perspective. Bryan, looking from your seat, you know, how did it look from where you sat, and then how did you kind of get involved?
Well, it's neat. You hear Tor talk about the origin of the company, and I think another conversation we had, he was saying, "I didn't even, set out to have a business, right? We were going to give this away." And I think when I hear those things, I'm like, so glad you didn't. And so yeah, so I think where I came in, was when we were with DevDog, and DevDog was a publisher. We had some of our own assets, and Odin came in, and it was really our top selling, most performant asset. And then some things unfolded. I was brought in to help with marketing back then, and we used to do a big giveaway, which was really fun, a Christmas giveaway, and so we were doing all of that. And then the idea of this, Unity has this VSP program, Verified Solutions Partnership Program. And this was back in the DevDog days. It looked like something that might have made sense for Odin, right? And so we just started the conversation, reached out to somebody at Unity, and then that's where that conversation started. And I think that spurred us on towards where we're at now. Like that caused us to look at the business model, right? Like, are we a sustainable company? Where are we going? We're one of the top assets in the Unity asset store, but we're not, we're selling a lot of assets. We're selling a lot at the current, the current licensing model, yet we're still not, it doesn't look sustainable. You buy it once, support it forever, right? Update it forever. Odin is a really robust tool, and there's a lot of work that goes in there, right? And so we began to see that more clearly when we were going down the VSP road. And so I think that really was a catalyst for us, like to where we are now. Like once we started having the conversations with Unity, took a lot longer than we thought. Then COVID came in. We were all set to go have a booth at GDC. We were like, they were going to fly us out there. We thought, hey, we made it. And then COVID hit and kind of shut everything down. But in the end, it's gone well. I think that's where I came in. And then since then, we've been running with it. I think it's a new thing for Unity too, relatively new. So I think we've been working alongside them I feel like truly a partner. We've ended up where we are now, and and we're still discovering things. It's still relatively new for us to have this enterprise licensing model, but it's going well. And I think we're very happy that we've gone through that transition.
No, I mean, I think that's super bunch of little pieces to grab onto there and talk about. I think the first thing that jumped out at me is you mentioned, there was a moment where you thought about giving it away for free, right? Which I think is a really interesting. So the whole open source movement, right, is a big part of the world, especially on the web side, right? And on the web side, I feel like they've gotten better at sustaining it and supporting it, but you still see a lot of XKCD, or somebody else posted a really funny, I think it was him. It was like one panel joke of like, here's the entire web ecosystem, and then here's this one package being maintained by some guy in Sweden holding the thing up, right? That like one dude has got this one library that everybody has built into their projects, right? And he's some open source developer by himself working out of his house, right? And this is something that I find really interesting. You mentioned kind of the idea of a sustainable business and a sustainable model. I think that in our space, right, if I'm looking, especially something like Odin, right, which is a piece of code or a library, a tool that I'm going to take into my project and build on top of, right, I do not want you guys to be like, you know what, we were doing this for a while, but now we're going to go do something else. Good luck, guys. Meanwhile, I'm working on a multi-year project, right? And I've got this thing in there and I'm depending on it, right? So I think that for anybody who is thinking a few steps ahead, we all want this to be a sustainable business model, right? And we want partners that we're building dependencies on to have sustainable business models, right? So I get that you might, in an asset store conversation or a pricing conversation, you might have some kind of hobbyist developers who are like, I don't want to pay whatever, these kind of tiny amounts of money, $50, you know what I mean? But once you kind of get to the level where people are saying, hey, I'm trying to make games as a business, I want to have partners who have a sustainable business model and that I can believe are going to be there. And I feel like, we talk about, there was a moment where people were like, a game engine, I don't know. Maybe I should make my own engine. I feel like that conversation has sailed, right? Now it's like very few people are, unless you're doing some hyper-specific thing, very few people are saying, like, except for the biggest studios, are rolling their own engines. Pretty much anybody, I'm generalizing, right? There's obviously edge cases and so on. But the kind of game engine conversation has been had. And now I feel like this is almost the next level of the conversation. Be like, okay, well, am I going to count on you? Am I going to count on you? Like, am I going to take this in and build on it? Are you guys going to be around? It's an interesting theme, and it totally ties into this idea of like, okay, yeah, are we selling it once? Or is it a subscription? Is it free? And how are we doing this and supporting it? Something that we're seeing evolving across the space and is super fundamental.
I love what you said, Matt, about how, I think I heard it right, it's best for all. Like doing it, making something that's sustainable. Odin is a great tool. It really is. It really helps a lot of people, and there's a great appreciation for it. So how do we, like, I guess I'm thinking like maximize the sweet spot, right? Like, okay, we've sold a lot of them. We've sold a lot of seats, under the previous licensing model or the current licensing model for most people. And that's been great. But it's like I said, we hit a wall like of we're not going to be able to continue to do this. Or if we are, we're just going to be in this state, you know? And so I think how do it's hard to tell the community like, hey, we're really doing this for you. It may not feel like it or look like it, but we haven't had very much pushback. There has been a few comments here and there, but we probably spent, I would say, the majority of our time before we actually launched it was like, what's going to happen in this scenario? What's going to happen in that scenario? What about the community at large? And so we were very mindful of that. We still are now as we plan for the future. What's this going to do? How do we maximize? We want everyone to be using Odin. We feel like Unity's better with Odin. And so how do we get that out to the masses the best way, right? And it's not something where it's like, how do we maximize the profit in doing so? It's more like, how do we create a sustainable model that's going to do that?
Yeah. Which involves profit, right? I think this is something for,
absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like, I feel like as people who work in the business and who are maybe here we are talking publicly, right? An opportunity to educate people. You want your partners to be profitable. You do not want your partners to be squeaking by on razor thin margins, right? Because that's the buffer between existence and non-existence, right? So having people, obviously you don't want to be in a situation where your partner has a monopoly and you're totally captured and they can set whatever price they want. That's probably an unhealthy position. And there's ways that it can go sideways, but broadly speaking, you want the people that you're building these links and dependencies with to be profitable, and because that is what sustainable looks like, right? And I think we shouldn't be shy about saying, hey, I'm trying to run a profitable business here so I can be a part of this ecosystem and community for the long term. And not be like, oh, well, actually, somebody came along, offered me a really good job with some stock options, and I'm out of here, because that obviously happens,
We really were in that subsistence stage for, let's say, the whole time until we launched Enterprise. We were like below minimum wage pretty much for like years and years, and working very hard. And I mean, we were starting to get kind of stressed out and feel like, is this ever going anywhere? Is this worth doing at all? Like, more profit wasn't materializing. It's like you've kind of maxed out the non-enterprise part of the market, if you will, and you just don't earn more off of that kind of license. Then, I mean, you either have to do something like enterprise or you have to stop.
So we've kind of mentioned enterprise. Let's introduce that. What is that for you guys? What does it mean? What are you selling? What is that model for Odin?
Right. So for us, it was something that we introduced last year, mid-year, and it is a subscription model that is paid per seat, where anybody who wants to use Odin, but if they work for an entity that has more than $200,000 in annual revenue, then they have to get the enterprise license. They're not allowed to use the old license, which we now call personal.
Yeah.
But otherwise, feature-wise, it's pretty similar. Odin has plugins for itself. Like we have something called the project validator, and enterprise obviously includes all plugins and also will include new ones as we release them with no extra charge.
Right.
But anybody else will have to get the plugins by themselves.
Which is an interesting, yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. And as someone who worked at Unity, those revenue tiers and those terms all are very familiar, right? Unity, this is to a large extent basically the Unity pricing model, right? That if you're under 200K in revenue, you're entitled to use a free license. Once you get above 200K, you're required by the EULA to buy Pro or in some cases Plus seats. There's a kind of a middle ground there, right? That they kind of, the Plus product, which they honestly were like in the wilderness for a while.
I think it's 100,000 for Plus and 200,000 for Pro.
Exactly. So, and I would argue, I think the thing about that is that you have to get to a certain size to be able to make that work. Or more specifically, right, to do what Unity eventually did. I actually was at Unity right before the release of Unity 5 when they decided to make everything free, right? When they decided to take the personal edition to parity with Pro, right? Which at the time Pro had some price locked features.
I remember that, like nav meshes, render textures. Everybody was just like, "Yay, we have all these things now." It was great.
Totally. And which, if you look back now, just seem like kind of absurd, like post-processing was a Pro feature at one point, like brutal, kind of what you think now, like pretty brutal limitations of like what seemed like very fundamental tools. And that was part of Unity's evolution in terms of their pricing model, right? Was thinking about, okay, this is wild. And this is, so I was at Unity from 500 employees to 4,000 or whatever, like some large number, right? And back then, when there was 500 people, there were two mailing lists. One was called Bullshit, and the other was called Not Bullshit. And Not Bullshit was like official company business, and Bullshit was just like everything else.
That's great.
And what was crazy was that I got added, like my first, I was remote. I was based in New York, so I was remote. So I just got added to these email lists. And this flood of conversation was going on. I couldn't believe was happening in a public reply all with 500 people forum about the pricing model. And everybody from the CEO down was in there arguing and making the case of we should do this. Nobody's going to buy a license ever again. They're all going to abandon. Our revenue's going to go to nothing. Like every side of that argument was argued. And I was like, did I get added to the wrong email list? Should I be reading this? Coming from other companies where it was like, this was like top secret stuff that would never be discussed in a public, or in a company-wide forum. So that was kind of amazing. But I remember them wrestling with that decision, right? And it was scary to be like, okay, we're going to believe that making this transition is net more revenue than it did. And in my opinion, it proved out, right? They went on a huge growth spurt and obviously the company grew and many, many things changed. Those mailing lists got shut down, a lot of stuff happened, right? That led us to a very different place. But there is a kind of a phase change there where it's like you have to, the model can't stay the same in order to grow. When you're a certain size and you just need a certain amount of sales to kind of get there and keep the lights on, fine, right? But once you have something where this is a tool a lot of people are using, we need to support it, we need to keep it compatible with different states, you have to look for that next model, I think.
I think there's a stigma too within these studios. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier about will the developer leave? Something better comes along, right? And I've talked to a couple people at some studios and they're like, hey, we won't even, it's a policy to not even bring in a third party tool. Like it's just a policy. It doesn't matter how good it is. It's our policy. We do not do it. So I'm like, why is that? And they said, well, it's because we've been burned too many times. I think that's another why the BSP program with Unity's something really good, I think, is that it's giving these studios reassurance. Okay, Unity's behind it. Now maybe we can take a look, right? And so I think that's a big benefit to us as we've done this because I think it's still there, even still, but I think as time goes on, we're sort of writing the story a little bit. Like people that make good things for Unity should be rewarded and sustained.
It's true on many levels. And I think it's a topic that I think is interesting to talk about. And the question of which plays out outside of the kind of idea of selling a tool, but the kind of not invented here syndrome. It's something that we see in the whole world of software, right? Not just in games. At least to me, we were talking about like the debate of like use a game engine or not. Well, I think that now has gotten to the point where it's only the kind of most, not to characterize anybody in an unfair way, right? But there's probably a minority now who would be like, no, we cannot adopt a game engine. That's somebody else's technology, right? So that barrier has kind of fallen, in my opinion.
So everybody these days has their own little hobby engine, right? But it's not for serious use now. Now it's just something you do for fun on the side. Like I have an engine I'm writing, and so does everybody else in our company. I know a lot of people who do that. But you're right in that it's not like usually these days you're going like, oh, well, we got to use Unreal or Unity or Lumberyard or, whatever else. Because it's just also there's just so much in an engine these days, right? It's just there's this common library of things that games should be able to do now. That wasn't always the case. And solving all of those problems for all platforms, because now a game doesn't just have to be for one platform. You can't just say, well, this works on Windows 2000 or Windows XP on these machines. That's no. It has to be Mac, it has to be Linux, it has to be Windows, it has to be mobile. Maybe it has to run on the web. You can't do all of that. It's such a huge investment. It's not worth it for anybody anymore.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, it's also something that I think there's a force here that is playing into this. I think there's a kind of a market pressure to adopt tools based on what you said, in the sense that there's just now a higher expectation of what any kind of game-like piece of software has to do, right? Like people just have a level of assumptions that if your game is not doing that, people are going to be like, what? Like it's like, for example, it's only on one platform? Like,
yeah.
What? Like, why? Like, it's like gamers would be like, what do you mean? Like, unless it was like a business reason, right? That's like more likely now that like, no, this is a Sony studio, it's PlayStation exclusive. But the idea that there would be like a technical reason that your game could not be on PlayStation and Xbox at the same time, people almost just like people would just be like, no, that's
not done.
Yeah, that's just expected, right? Which, I think there's a parallel to this that we see probably more relevant to the kind of AAA level, where just the amount of content and the amount of fidelity is exponentially increasing, right? People want 4K, they want 4K textures, they want the kind of pressure on development teams in terms of resources is kind of, I wonder, unless we get like magic AI make everything button, which I know a lot of people are trying to work on and figure out, right? Like, I wonder how that continues. Yeah, exactly. Art Engine is one of the.
Yeah, and the engine can do that. That's the next engine problem, right? It's insane the amount of content in games these days, and that's why people need these ever more powerful tools to make them, of course, which is also partly where we come in with Odin, via Unity as well. And also just look at the download sizes of games these days. It's grown, it's almost obscene in a way, right? You're like, really? You want 200 gigabytes of my disk space for the largest ones? It's like, oh my God. You can have you have a large disk and you can have 5 games installed at once.
Yeah, it's true. No, it's crazy. I think that this is probably why both actually kind of drawing parallels between the consumer side and the tooling side, that we see a lot of the game platforms moving towards subscription models, right? Because they're like, if we spent $500 million on this, we cannot sell it for $60 and charge you once, right? Like, so they're moving away from that too, and that's why this free to play has become so big, and all this pressure on microtransactions and so on, is that, funnily enough, the price of games at retail has not actually gone up in, I don't know, what is it, 20 years, right? It's like $60. That's it, right? You don't see $120 games, right? Like, even if it's Red Dead Redemption and there was like 5 million people working for 100 years, like, so
Yeah, that is a good point. It's pretty much, it's a good analogy. It's almost exactly the same case.
Yeah.
Things are just getting so much more difficult to do, and take ongoing effort to keep them updated and running everywhere and so on. And it's just so expensive that, buy one, support forever is just, it's hard. It's very, very hard to do. And even if you're committed to doing it, maybe at some point after a few years, you go like, do we really have to do this? This hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is it's a good reason to be having this kind of conversation in the public, and especially kind of maybe we're comparing parallels that game developers themselves are feeling this pain too, right? They're like, "Oh, I've got a sim launch across 5 platforms and provide customer support at launch for 500 different broken PC configurations and a bunch of angry PlayStation players." And I mean, hopefully they're all happy and delighted, right? But we hear all those kind of launch horror stories, right? And I think that kind of drawing that parallel maybe makes it easier for folks to understand. And I think helps to make it clear, right, why we might all be out looking for. I mean, I had my own very minuscule experience on the asset store. I wanted to try out publishing on the asset store. I made a procedural generation asset called Strata, a 2D tile map level generator, right, that was relatively small and simple, and put it up there for $10, I think. And kind of as an experiment, I didn't make a huge investment in it, and it was kind of selling and ticking over. But the thing that I just started to see was just that the kind of, even if I was only providing 2 or 3 hours of support a month relative to the revenue that was coming in, I was effectively losing money on it. That it was a niche thing, which there was a core group of people who were like, this is amazing, we love this is so useful for my little roguelike game, But then just, the amount of people who were just like obviously coming in who were like students, people who were trying to, I mean, as I'm sure you guys experience in your own world of support, right? People who just don't know how to do anything and then are like, I bought this thing, you need to help me. And I'm like, yo, you paid me $10. You can't even get like a fraction of an hour of my time for this. As someone who sells time for a living, right? I run an agency and I know what my time can earn on the market, right? Like, I'm sorry. God bless you. I wish you luck with your game, but I cannot spend my time telling you how to fix your sprites, So
that's really, especially in the asset store, I think maybe that's, at least there's this, I don't want to call it toxic because that has all kinds of connotations these days, but it's a kind of unfortunate situation that a lot of the asset store finds itself in. And if you go in and you read some of the internal asset store publisher forums, some of the most popular threads are the threads that are full of like customer horror stories, or where people complain about, oh my God, and I got a 1-star review from this unreasonable person whom I couldn't help because they had a problem. It's literally not a thing I can solve.
Yeah.
And, and so on. Yeah, it's very developer hostile in many ways, the way it's set up right now. So, I mean, Unity are aware of this, of course, and they're always working to fix it. So I'm optimistic that it's not going to remain like this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that look, customer service is always difficult, right? And especially when you're dealing with the general public, there's always a lowest common denominator of person who just walked in off the street, doesn't know where they are. And there's a kind of an element of chaos in it, right? That we all have that you kind of have to sign up for when you put something out in the public. I mean, I took my asset down. I got to the point where I was like, and honestly, it was not even because it was so much, because the volume of support requests was actually relatively low. It was more just a kind of noise in the back of my mind where I was like, man, this thing is not making that much money. And I've got these kind of like slightly angry people in my inbox, and like I have to go and do these other projects. And so I just was like, you know what, I made the decision to pull it down. And then I've, of course, thought about open sourcing it, right? There was a moment where I was like, I'm going to try to open source it and collect donations and see if that can make back the volume of income that it was generating as a kind of an experiment. And of course, I haven't. It's a low priority, so I haven't done it yet,
That was actually our thinking with Odin. For a long time, we're like, if this doesn't work out, then we're just going to have to open source it and just start taking contributions. And at least that would be like the lowest impact way of shutting it down, if you will, while still trying to keep it going for the people who are using it at the very least. That was That was our thinking if things ever went awry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, there's a part of me somewhere having watched, I mean, I think Unity hit a smart kind of channel there in the sense that it was never open source, but there was this free layer, right, which allowed lots of people to adopt it. Because what I'll say, it's interesting. I'm actually right in this experience. I'm working on my kind of early game design prototyping stage on my Untitled Cute Space game, which is our internal production at Thousand Ant. And I have adopted a couple asset store assets, right? Namely, Odin is in there and zero complaints. What I have been using, and I'm not going to call them complaints, but I do feel some friction around, is I've been using some of Opsiv's assets, right? Another well-known and respected asset store publisher. And I've been using their Ultimate Inventory System and what's the other one? The Behavior Designer, which are both great tools. I really like them. I would actively recommend them to everybody. But there's a moment that I experience with both of them, which is, and maybe this is just me being spoiled from being in the Unity ecosystem, right? Is that when I go to Google things, right? Whereas if I'm Googling Unity problems, there's thousands of people who have encountered it. There's a scale of people talking about it and solving problems that is out there. And I can literally just Google almost any nav mesh agent stuck in place. There he was. Whatever it was, he couldn't get to the point and he was stuck, or he wasn't on the nav mesh. Like, okay, yeah, that was it. Whereas as you start to get into you get to a smaller and smaller pool, and that some of that effect slows down, and maybe you find it, maybe you don't. But there's a part of me that I think that was and actually I think that, just to throw a little salt at Unity, I think that one of the things that they have gone wrong on recently is the fragmentation into different render pipelines, different scripting backends. Some of that splitting off into pieces has made it hard, as when I was working there, made it harder to make tutorials, harder to document functionality. That fragmentation really works against that kind of critical mass of community effect. And there's a part of me that believes that the open source thing kind of would solve that, right? Lots of people would be using it. Maybe you would get great contributions, or maybe just lots of people would talk about it, and that kind of massive adoption would somehow drive it to the next thing. Now, whether you can make any money doing that, and actually, I don't know. Do you guys want to try? Right? Do you want to risk your livelihood?
I mean,
it's a big
question.
There
is actually part of Odin that is open source, that we open sourced a few years back, specifically the Serializer.
Yeah.
Which is this way of saving and loading data, to put it simply, right? You can send it over the network, or put it in a file, or whatever, put it in an asset. But we open sourced that mostly for the reason that we thought it would be useful for the community, because the only thing that the community had would be, before, it was full Serializer, or a bunch of the random .NET ones, or what Unity has, which is often lacking. So, but the idea was also that then other tools would start using it, and we would get, pull requests with the bugs that they found, and then we would get those into Odin, and it benefits everybody with the rising tide and everything.
Yeah.
We haven't really gotten many pull requests, actually. Most people just use it.
That's interesting. Have you seen that people are adopting it? Like, do you have a sense of how it's gone from the adoption side?
Yeah, a bunch of assets. I have no idea how many. I know that Bolt, the visual scripting solution that Unity bought, was using Odin Serializer for its set, like Bolt 2.0 that Laszlo was working on. Because before, Bolt 1 used full Serializer, and Bolt 2 now was using Odin Serializer when Unity bought Bolt.
That's interesting. That's
one of our largest, I think, adopters of third parties.
Sort of feels like it's a pivotal time in some ways. We're talking about the open source ideology versus these enterprise subscriptions, and it feels like a time where we're in a transition, right? Like, I feel like subscriptions are becoming more widely accepted. I don't know about widely is the best word, but more accepted. But I also think that the only companies that are going to do well in that are companies that deserve the subscription. or deserve the price, right?
Yeah.
Like they're worthy of it. Because right now, anyone can go throw up a subscription model and say, okay, that's how we're going to sustain our company. But if you don't have something that's worthy of a subscription, then you're just not going to go somewhere. And I think if you go all the other way, if you go all open source, it sounds good. Like both things have their pluses and minuses,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, how do people continue to use great things and those great things continue to get greater? I don't know that there's a perfect model right now. It's nice to be in the space. It's nice to be figuring it out,
Yeah,
in a
totally.
I
Totally.
wonder if there's any way of combining those approaches. Could you
Yeah.
have like an open source, but you can't use it if you're earning more, and then you need to get the enterprise, but it's open source
I mean,
ish.
that is
I don't know. Is
that
that a
is
thing?
There might
almost
be.
what Unity has done. That's all. Unity kind of walked up to the edge of that, but it's not actually open source, right? It's
Yeah,
free to use, but not actually
I
open
want the
source.
native. I want the native code.
Yeah,
I want
I
to see
get
the
it.
native part of Unity so bad. I hate when I go through a stack trace and I go look at their code and then I'm like, and then it just does some native call to the internal part of the engine. Then you go like, oh well, I guess I don't know what happens there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know, actually. I have no idea now what their roadmap is like. I think there was a moment where Unity recognized that making that kind of ball of native code at the beginning of it smaller and smaller was a good ambition for many reasons. I think that the chaos that kind of came out of the shift to packages has, I don't know if they're rethinking it or what, but I don't view the shift to packages as an, well, I think there's a disciplined way to do it. I don't see it as a net gain as it happened.
I
And
think chaos is a generous term for what happened with the packages so far.
yeah, yeah,
And I mean, there some of the packages are good depending on the team, right?
exactly.
Some of them are pretty great, and others are just not. And it's all these, it's kind of schizophrenic suddenly, the
Yeah.
development, right? And all these different teams doing each their own package. This one works with this specific version of Unity, and this one that it depends on now suddenly got updated. Now it only works with this other version of Unity, and now neither of them work. The way it's been done so far has been a mess, and it's also made it very difficult for both for games developers, but especially for tools developers who
course.
have to support a range of package versions across a range of Unity versions, and you don't know which version of package is going to be with which version of Unity and which other dependencies may or may not be there, and whether and the versions of those dependencies even. So it's like this infinitely complex web of dependencies and stuff that might or might not work or be there at all, and it's very difficult. And we've tried to sort of isolate ourselves from it.
Yeah.
With Odin, we've had far easier time of it than some other people have. Thank God we don't work with descriptive vendor pipelines.
I was going to say, yeah, I know Freya, who is making shapes, has had some real difficult struggles that she's talked publicly about, trying to maintain compatibility across all three render pipelines and all the struggles that come there. What I can say from kind of gossipy conversations that I'm having is that I think there is, and even from Unity's official messaging to a degree, is that I think there's a recognition that was not a resounding success, that approach, and that they are recalibrating around something more stable and compatible. To give them the benefit of the doubt and to be charitable, Unity always had a developer-first culture. And when I say developer first, I mean internal developer, engine developer first, right? There was colloquial, simple way of saying it is that the developers really just built whatever they wanted, was how it was for years and years and years, right? That they were just kind of making stuff that they thought they should make. And it was a kind of an anarchist approach for a long time. And there is a real strength to that, right? Like if you have really talented people just able to kind of unbureaucratically make what they believe they should make, I think that can work really well with 500 people. You get to 4,000 people, that's a different mountain of ants, right? And so I think they're going through a kind of a phase change there, that they had an approach that kind of worked at a certain size, and then they got huge pretty fast, over about 5 years, and suddenly they realized, I think, or maybe now they're in the process of realizing that they have to become more bureaucratic and regimented, which of course many people will scream and cry about, but I think you can't have an army where everybody, you could have a little ragtag band where everybody just knows what to do, but once you get to, that scale, there's just too much entropy.
It's probably, I think that's probably one of Unity's two big issues. I would say the second issue is probably that they're not making games. They're not.
Hotly debated topic. Hot topic.
That's the thing. They're not dog fooding their own product in the way that they're not building some huge, like, top of the line Unity game and then maintaining that into the future.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably, if they'd been doing that for the past 5 years, Unity would be a better engine now, because they wouldn't feel more keenly where the real issues and pain points are and where their effort would best be spent, right? It's a huge guide.
Totally. I mean, the funny thing is, I'm on your side, and I was one of the minority at Unity for many years who waved the flag for this idea. But I remember John Riccatello getting on stage and being like, this is a competitive advantage that we don't compete with our customers. Which, if you look at Unreal, you know, basically stealing Fortnite from PUBG, you can make the case, right? You can make the case. They had, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get too gossipy, but like, well, there was a lawsuit.
Whatever
it's in the public, right? You know.
Whatever the case, though, I'm sure Unreal is a better engine because Fortnite was made with it and they got that experience. Just on a pure product level, at the very least, I'm sure that's the case.
I think you can make that argument. Yeah. I mean, I think for sure internalizing that pain of development, of being like, why does this work this way? Why doesn't it work when I try to do this? And having those people be on the same team, and the artist can go yell at the developer and be like, hey, my art won't render. Like, what have you done to the engine, right? And as opposed to there's a customer outside the wall kind of yelling in saying that, there is just a very different kind of power dynamic there.
And I think just for their approach, they at very least have to be very probably aware of that, right? They need to compensate for that factor.
Yeah, which
but, I mean,
they are to some extent, but
they are.
But yeah, I mean, you can argue the results, right? I think that I mean, I know that. Well, it's also the other thing that I'll say that I'll put on my defending Unity hat here. The thing that I'll say is that, you know, and I've said this before publicly, they are trying to do something. I would argue that Unreal supports a narrower range of use cases. Right.
Absolutely.
You know, and so they're trying to build a huge piece of technology that everyone wants to do everything, right? Just the way they want it. And that's a kind of an unprecedented thing, right? Nobody's done that before.
The thing Unity's trying to do is insanely difficult. Yeah. I mean, I don't envy them the task. Also scaling up and trying to basically what they've been doing with ECS and Burst, and they're trying to reinvent the whole engine, which I think is all of these technical ideas they've got on the surface, even the scriptable render pipelines, great, right? They're going in so many very, very, very good directions. It's just the task is so hard. Yeah. And I think along with the packages, some of that just sort of slipped a bit. Yeah. I am confident that, you know, they're going to get there, and the target they've set is amazing. And I love that direction. I
mean, I agree. The vision, I think, is a good one, right? And it's a more of a question of getting the implementation right? And getting the team structured in the right way, getting the incentives in the right direction so that everybody can kind of push in the right direction towards the vision, which, I agree, is a vision worth achieving, right? So, we'll see. I mean, I think that it's also going to be interesting to me that, well, here's a question, right? Do you think, is it possible now for another engine company to come in and kind of do what Unity or Epic did and kind of get to their size and legitimately compete as a commercial engine? That's a very good question. Not a hobby engine, right?
Not without massive, massive resources and effort, I think. And I mean, you would need to be like basically Amazon or Google or some other giant to be able to do that and have the market push it out there. And I think even look at Amazon with Lumberyard. I mean,
I was going to say, funny you should mention Amazon, like,
right? Even Amazon, they tried, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't worked out that well for them at all.
Yeah. I mean, Amazon is a fascinating company, right? And obviously crushingly effective in many ways, but their approach to getting into games of kind of just really turning on the money fire hose and trying to hire all these amazingly talented people I mean, somehow has not produced results for them.
You look at the approach of, like you mentioned, the chaos of the developer first mentality.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, that's what made Unity what it is. And you can't have that in Amazon. Like you couldn't start with that sort of mentality. You already have to start with the bureaucratic like system, and that would probably limit you there as well.
Totally agree. I think it's a great point. And I think it's why we see so many acquisitions, right? That it's easier to let someone build something up as an independent, scrappy, chaotic outfit and then let them succeed to some degree and then swoop in with your big pile of money and buy them.
Yeah. And I mean, has anybody ever made an engine that's successful for the sake of making an engine, but without the initial goal of making a game with the engine? Even Unity, which no longer makes games. Unity was originally created to make a game, and they, if I recall the story correctly, they thought the game wasn't that great, so they dropped it. But the engine was great, so they continued with that. And that was the original story.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, I mean, we do see, again, going back to the open source thing, we see stuff like Godot, which I think is interesting, and I do see it growing. Interestingly, I think Epic gave them a big grant, which was kind of funny and surprising. I mean, I'm like, great, okay, awesome. Just kind of almost like trollish in a good way, but I think that what I think is here's me giving free business advice to Unity, and I told them this when I was there. I think that look at Blender. Look at what Blender now is with 2.8 or whatever the new version with the good user experience is, as opposed to the old crazy user experience, right?
Still hard to get into.
Yeah, it is.
That's right.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I super bounced off at like boing, but I mean, I'm not good at 3D modeling anyway. But what you see, Blender now is getting real adoption. Like Blender is cutting in to Autodesk's pie, right? In a way that was not happening before. And I do think long term for Unity and Epic that is something that could happen, right? Is that I feel like you say, it's probably got to be Google, Amazon, and I would say, or open source, right? Is that there could be a kind of a Blender-like that probably takes 20 years. They probably got some time to see it coming.
Blender has been around for so long. I remember way back, and we were using Blender because it was free, right? And we couldn't afford the insane licensing fees for everything else. It wasn't me using it because I had learned 3ds Max originally. I was educated as a 3D artist.
Oh, interesting.
Once upon a time, before I turned into programming.
Yeah,
but I mean, Blender always struck me as being made out of a bunch of really solid, dedicated developers with a strong ethos and strong knowledge of exactly what they were doing and where they were going.
Yeah.
And they've just kept chugging at it for on and on and on and on. And now they're at a great place. Yeah, and it makes sense because Blender is an amazing product. Yeah. They have basically feature parity with some of the huge solutions out there, right? Yeah. Which is an amazing achievement.
Exactly. No, I mean, I talked to 3D artists and they're kind of like, yeah, I was on Maya and then I tried Blender and I was like, no, but then I tried it again and it was getting closer, and now many of them are kind of saying, yeah, I'm, outside of a studio where they're paying for my Maya license, I'm not,
I wonder if you were to ask them too, like, could you do that again? Could somebody do that? Like, because times are changing too so much, right? Like the time when Blender went through their paces to get to where they are now, could you do that again? I mean, maybe, but there's so much involved and everything happens so fast now that it's be a tall order. But I love the idea that, the more creative, like I feel like Unity does that well. And that's how I got into Unity to begin with. That's why I'm at Sirenix, is because I saw Unity as an opportunity to create, like unlimited ability to create just about anything I want. And I wasn't, so interested in games when I first started getting into Unity. It was more augmented reality. And I thought, I kept seeing Unity splashed over everything. So I thought, I'll get into it and I'll learn it. And then it turned out to be free. And the next thing you know, now I almost do everything in Unity. Like as opposed to going into like Photoshop or GIMP, I'm going to Unity. Yeah. I don't know, it's always the ideal tool, but the ability, the fact that I could figure just about anything out really as a creator is a great thing to have. Unity represents that.
I
Wow.
totally agree. And I have that experience too, funnily enough, of being like, well, I could do this in After Effects, but I could actually probably do this faster in Unity, And then
Yeah.
like that's kind of crazy, right? Because I've used After Effects I mean, not well, but like I've used After Effects for 20 years, I'm not a motion graphics artist, right? But I could just do some basic stuff. But I'm like, oh, I could go open After Effects, which I haven't used in a while, or I could just do this in Unity, which I'm in every day. So that's also an interesting point about, which also is to zoom out on what Unity is trying to do right now, right? And they just had their IPO, and they're, in my opinion, and this is not insider information, right? SEC, don't put me in jail, right? But like the thing that is there that Wall Street is looking at with their share price is the idea that they're going to become the everything engine, right? People, I feel like with what Wall Street is looking at with this Unity stock is, okay, yeah, it's a game engine. The gaming market, we kind of know how big that is. That's priced in, right? Could it become kind of operating system platform for VR and AR? Arguable, right? They're kind of sort of there, right?
They pretty much are.
Right?
I mean,
Like
aren't they? Is
if
there
you're
like
in that
there's
space, I mean,
you're
yeah,
in
you could be in
Unity.
Unreal, but probably you're in Unity, right? At some point they had 70, 80% market share. So it's like, okay, if you believe that that's going to be huge, well, then that's the thing. And then all this stuff with automotive, real-time animation, all those things, right? I mean, I do think on the zooming out, like actually on our agency business, we've been working with Unity on this real-time animation project, or Real-Time Rascals, which has been super interesting to work on, working with a traditional TV offline, or I don't even know, it's funny, I don't know what to call it, non-real-time animation team, right? In making a
Yeah.
real-time animation, a lot of interesting communication and figuring things out between those two teams. But I gotta say, I think actually this is a win for Epic, but like The Mandalorian, this real-time workflow is coming to production and animation. It's inevitable, in my opinion. It's gonna be, especially now with all this
Yeah.
crazy stuff with LED walls, and it's just better. It's green screen, forget about it. It's out of here, right? In, I don't know, I always say 5 years, but it's probably 2 years, like the way everything goes so fast now. So there's this whole thing of where, yeah, like you say, Bryan, it really could become like the everything engine, the Photoshop killer, the After Effects killer, you make your movie in it and your video game and your tablet app. And so that's kind of like the crazy, and I think, and John Riccatello of Unity, the CEO of Unity, has made that case, when he talks to like more, not non-game audiences, right? Like people outside the industry, he's like, this is what we think. This is going to be the kind of real-time platform for everything, which
And
I think is,
I
yeah,
can totally see that happening, honestly. It makes so much sense. I remember back when I was I was at Unite, and they were unveiling the second Adam one,
yeah,
which was the one done by a director, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I was
Blake,
like,
yeah,
oh, I never thought of doing movies in Unity, but that's brilliant. I was like, that's a genius idea. And that they also did the Baymax thing, right? And I can totally imagine that would have been so much faster and easier and cheaper to do in Unity with very good results. I mean,
yeah,
the live 3D, like real-time rendering, if you will, is almost at a point where it's definitely much better than what we had like even 15 years ago with like more dedicated rendering for most budgets, right?
yeah, exactly. And that's the interesting point for most budgets, right? So I think that there's a moment there now where I think we're going to start to see that tipping, and it's going to start from the bottom, the low budgets and the indies and the experimental people and all that, students, all that marginal kind of stuff. But somebody's going to get a hit. Something's going to happen that's going to hit and blow up. And at a certain point, people are going to be like, oh, forget it. This is the thing now, I think that's probably 2-3 years away, honestly. I think I always say 5-10 years, but you have to cut everything in half now because of the internet. It's all just about twice as fast.
Everything's going so quickly. The
Yeah.
world changes every 5 years.
Well, and that's the thing too, because Unity, they keep coming out, like Cinemachine is is an amazing. I
Yeah.
did spend some time with it, and I thought the same thing. Like I could tell stories here.
Yeah.
I could make a movie. I could make a commercial. I can make short gifs or whatever
Yeah.
to explain things. But I think it's will they be able to so they come out with this really great idea, like Reflect is a good one. Unity
Yeah.
Reflect,
Yep.
really great idea, but it's kind of been slow to get out because it's complicated. And,
Yeah.
when they rolled it out and they thought, okay, we can do this, they had some really great studio make a really great use case, but I don't know that anybody else could do that. Like they don't
Yeah.
have the developers that are capable of making what they're presenting this tool to do, right? So will they be able to fix some of the problems we were talking about earlier in this conversation, because if they're going to be everything to everyone, that's a
Yeah,
difficult.
I mean, but those kinds of skills are going to become more prevalent. That's kind of what has to happen in the
Yeah.
future. Every company is a software company, right?
Yeah.
They do software and then something else. They kind of have to.
It's funny that
Yeah.
you say that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
my other thesis as a marketing person is that in the future, every company is a media company.
Say that again.
My kind of parallel thesis to that is that in the future, every company is a media company. That not only are we all going to get eaten by software, which I totally agree, but also that there's this trend of disintermediation and the death of the media where we all have to become our own media entity, publishing, getting traffic, getting attention. It's like we had this kind of trend of civilization spreading out, everybody niching down, specializing. And then I think we may see now this kind of boomerang back on that of okay, no, actually we have to do our marketing in-house. We have to, yeah.
Well, who wins in that sort of situation is people who are good creators or have creative, we're all going to be creators, I think, at some point. And then also, again, you have to have something good. Like you can't just be a media company or you can't just be a media person if you don't have something to present.
Yeah.
So I like the sound. I love the idea of that because that gets rid of a lot of the talkers or the ones that,
totally.
It's all marketing and not product,
Yeah.
which is there's a lot of those companies out there. And I think they kind of ruin it for the rest of us sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just kind of artificial growth or, inflated growth through ads and user acquisition. And totally. I mean, I think that stuff is, I'm not going to say it's over because there are people still doing it right now and winning, but I don't think it's lasts. I don't think it's sustainable. I think there's a bubble in all that stuff. Google is the one who captures all the value in that model. That can't last. Like they're running an ad auction and they take 99 cents on every dollar. Like nobody can build a business that way. It's over. It's like that's a dead model. I mean, that's literally why I think everybody has to become a media company is because you can't run a business on that. They've got an auction and they're going to push you right up to, the product costs $1 and they take 99 cents for the ad. Like that's over. So I think that this is what forces us into this other model. And I think, Bryan, you're exactly right that the people who win, and maybe this is wishful thinking, right? Maybe we're a bunch of creator people and this is what we want to believe, but I believe it. I really believe it, that I think that the future belongs to the creators, people with a perspective, people with a position and the wherewithal talent to execute, get it out there and find an audience and serve them, build a community, I think that's the only thing that's going to happen. And I think we're all just kind of catching up to that realization, which I find super exciting. I don't know. To me, this is an optimistic moment.
I do too.
Yeah.
I get really excited about that. I would say too, that I think of all the companies, like go back to Unity, they have they have the potential to be that, right? Like maybe more so than just about anyone else. Like, it's going to be a difficult road, but I think they have this foundation built and they have a history already of doing these kinds of things. So good to be a part of it.
Totally. I totally agree. Yeah. And I mean, it's worth saying, and I'm sure somebody will go and cut a little highlight out of this, hour-long conversation of me saying something really mean about Unity, but it's worth noting I'm betting my business on it. I mean, obviously you guys are as well, right? You're bought in deep, right?
Like we're not much without them.
Yeah. So I mean, you guys are, on the team, and I am as well. I mean, we're up to our eyeballs in Unity, and we believe it's the future.
That's why we have to be critical because we love them and we depend on them and we live in there with them, right? So it's.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's important, right? It's like the loyal opposition, right? You have to kind of hold people to account if you feel like they're not meeting their potential, which is enormous, right? So, no, it's...
Well, I would say, too, our experience has been good, I think, in going through the VSP and we're communicating with them more regular. And I do get this feeling, and I feel it strongly, that they are looking out for the community. Like they really do want to see Unity be better, just like all of us. It comes across in most of our communications for sure.
Totally.
Yeah, everybody at Unity that we've talked to at any time has always been great.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single negative interaction I've ever had where I'm like, oh, that wasn't great. No, it's always been awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally. And I think, you know, as someone who used to work there, I can say that it's you know, it's gotten bigger and bigger, but I think it still is a mission-driven company, right? People believe in the idea. I know I did, you know, and do still, even though I don't work there anymore. I believe in the potential and the mission of empowering creators and facilitating more creators in the world. I think it's a net positive, right? So
yeah, and now it's no longer even they're democratizing game development. They want to democratize everything development.
yeah,
That was it, right?
yeah, totally.
There you are.
Yeah, totally. Well, this has been super awesome, guys. I'm really glad we went all over the place. It's got a little spicy. Yeah. It's always fun.
Round.
Yeah, and we'd love to do it again sometime. And for folks who want to find you online, check out what you guys are doing, where should they head to?
You can find us on the asset store if you search Odin, or you can find us on, let's see, unity.com/products/Odin, and you can find us on odininspector.com.
Beautiful. Awesome.
And a great place to go is our Discord channel. There's a lot of fun in there. I mean, I think people are very active. They're really, really cool. It's not a very intimidating place like some of them can be. So
yeah.
come hang out. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll do that. Cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys, and we'll do it again soon.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.